Over the last few lessons, we've been talking about the government and administration of Henry VII. I want to spend some time in this lesson just focusing on one very specific aspect of his reign. This is the use of what are known as JPs, or Justices of the Peace. I want to talk about who the JPs were because that is quite significant for understanding the ways in which Henry was able to control the nobility. And then I will briefly go over some of the powers and responsibilities, their strategic use, and the limitations and accountability associated with their use. So fundamentally, as a sort of general overview, the use of justices of the peace were transformed into quite pivotal pillars of local governance over this time period, not necessarily just with Henry VII, but instrumental by Henry VII. Central to the Tudor efforts to restore royal authority were the use of these justices of the peace. Now, when thinking about who the JPs were, as in which parts of society did they come from, is what I'm asking in this question. Well, they were generally appointed from the gentry. They were typically chosen from the local gentry or maybe even some lesser landowners. Now, you might be thinking, well, why aren't they from members of the high nobility? Well, we know already that one of the aims that Henry VII had, because he has in the back of his mind what we pretty much understand to know that he has in the back of his mind for the majority of his reign, especially the early part of his reign, he has in the back of his mind the fears of the Wars of the Roses, the idea that at any point he could be theoretically ousted by a high-ranking member of the nobility, somebody who may or may not have a tenuous link to the throne in one way or another, married into the royal household by one stretch or another somewhere down the timeline, and maybe has potentially Yorkist sympathies, because of course Henry VII, being the sort of Lancastrian king that he was somebody who was not particularly fond of the idea of a Yorkist having a strong amount of authority. And so we know that through this, one of his key aims as king is to maintain himself as the key, most powerful figure in England. He doesn't want members of the nobility to have more influence or even the same amount of influence as he does. And so he wanted to try and prevent any kind of regional magnate from having any kind of dominance, which is one of the reasons why the gentry and lesser landowners and the local gentry were primarily the places where the justices of the peace would be selected from. In terms of numbers, there would be around 15 to 23 per county. Again, it's a rough statistic. This is a number that changes from county to county, from region to region, from time period to time period. The records on this aren't as easy to get a hold of as the records of other. If we were talking about like employment numbers today, for example. The appointments were also annual, and there was no salary. It was seen as a sort of civic duty and an honour to be a member of the Justices of the Peace. In terms of their powers and responsibility, they had certain court roles. So, for example, they chaired quarter sessions quarterly, hence the name, and they would handle a number of serious crimes. They might even see that the assize courts overseen by royal judges twice yearly. So, again, we don't need to know that much in terms of the idea of the assizes and the assize court system that existed in early English history, but just a citation there for you. But their expansion of legal authority can be seen during the reign of Henry VII, in fact. In 1487, for example, immediately after he took the throne, they were granted powers of bail to those who were awaiting trial, for example. In 1495, they had the ability to vet juries. They were given this ability to do so, potentially removing biased jurors in gentleman-related cases. In some cases, they were even empowered to act without a jury, except for cases which concerned the death penalty. In terms of their actual administrative duties, they would enforce all acts of Parliament. They would supervise things like weights and measures. They would also manage vagabond laws as part of the 1494 Vagabonds and Beggars Act, again, a part of the law that was passed by Henry. They also were supervising of all local law officers as well, so oversaw sheriffs, high constables, petty constables, and could investigate corrupt sheriffs as of 1495. This was a sort of like a police force in a way. Of course, the police don't get invented, established as an institution until they're established in London in the 1800s. But at least during this time period, the kind of the people who were administering the realm, who were overseeing justice in certain ways, who were supervising local law officers in other ways, were the justices of the peace. During Henry's reign, then, there was a strategic impact that needs to be referenced, because we have to think about this from a broader political impact, let's say. So, firstly, the justices of the peace undermined magnate power. By appointing local gentry rather than members of the nobility, Henry curtailed the influence of powerful regional nobility families. That's an important aspect of the use of the justices of the peace during this time period for Henry's personal and political gain and personal and political aspirations. They also would serve at the king's pleasure. There would be annual reappointments to ensure loyalty, and any opposition would risk removal. So the importance of noting that is to signify that this was a clear instrument of royal control, that despite the fact that Henry is delegating this authority to these individuals across the realm and all this kind of stuff, he was very much keen to ensure a very tight amount of control across his realm, across his kingdom, to ensure that there would not be rebellion, to ensure that there would not be potential usurpation, the idea of the continuation of the Wars of the Roses, the idea that his dynasty might be at risk. In terms of its limitations, there was a review system where their decisions on disputes could be overridden by the King's Bench, or even escalated to more formal legal structures like the assizes, for example. But these were quite rare often. These would be quite rarely the case. And then finally, to prevent JPs themselves from becoming too strong, which was a fear that Henry may have also had in the back of his mind, they were also a number of them were tied to their own bonds and recognizances. So this again echoes Henry's control not only over the nobility but over his own members of the local gentry, and more broadly echoing his control over society as a whole.